Pages from a Trump tax return sent to the New York
It's
Times
one of
by
American
certain
politics'
source.
biggest
What did they
secrets. How much taxes Donald Trump paid, and to whom does his company owe money? Few of the numbers have ever been made public. His missing financial figures a big issue in 2016.
Or maybe he doesn't want the American people, all of you watching tonight, to know that he's paid nothing in federal taxes. So
that makes
if
me
he's
smart.
paid
Nearly 4 years on, the president's financial secrets have ended up in the Supreme Court, and it has delivered a limited victory to Trump, with a ruling that means his money likely won't be a major issue this election season. The court case pitted the Trump empire against Congress and prosecutors. Democrats wanted access to company records. Trump's lawyers argued the opposition wanted to harass, not oversee the administration. The court found Nancy Pelosi wanted too many documents, but it didn't dismiss the Speaker's request outright.
The path that the Supreme Court has laid out is one that is clearly achievable by us in the lower court, and we will continue to go down that path.
But the court's decision isn't an overwhelming win for the president, because the Supreme Court also says his financial records must be turned over to New York state prosecutors, which could mean he could face charges in the future.
From a certain point, satisfied. From another point, I'm not satisfied, because frankly, this is a political witch hunt, the likes of which nobody's ever seen before. It's a pure witch hunt. It's a hoax.
Analysts say the court's ruling is a draw for the president, one that leaves the Supreme Court above the political fray as the US faces a bruising election season.
For more on today's rulings, I'm joined tonight by Scott Anderson. Scott has served as a legal advisor at the U.S. State Department. He's now with the Brookings Institution and teaches law at Georgetown University Law School. Scott is in Washington, D.C. tonight. Welcome to the day, Scott. It's good to have you with us. The court today said that the president is not above the law when we're talking about the justice system and gathering evidence. What does this ruling, these two rulings, what do they say about the American justice system, and what do they tell us about the current U.S. president?
Well, they certainly serve as noted victories, although in some ways limited victories for the rule of law. And it's important that you think of the two opinions separately. The Vance opinion related to a subpoena against the president, or for the president's financial records, I should say, to a bank by the state of New York. And the court essentially affirmed that the state of New York can proceed with that subpoena, is entitled to that information, that the president doesn't have any special protection by virtue of being president to prevent that information from being disclosed. And that's going to allow the state of New York to continue in doing criminal investigations and other investigations the same way it would against other business leaders. But it's not going to lead to the disclosure of that information becoming public, simply because there's still a grand jury process and other protections to the disclosure of that information that the state of New York has indicated that it intends to respect. The second case, the Mazars case, was by several committees in Congress. And in that case, the Supreme Court came back and said, contrary to what the president was arguing, yes, there are, in fact, a range of cases in which Congress can subpoena this sort of information about the president from third parties, banks and his accountant in this case, and that is not such a high standard that the court argued to make it, that the president argued to make it essentially impossible. In fact, there's a variety of situations where the Congress may be able to do this. But it also said it still implicates the separation of powers, and it's important that Congress and the courts weigh the different factors regarding Congress's interests and the executive branch's interests and reach an accommodation or a balance between them. And so it remanded those requests to the lower courts to re-examine those factors, as it felt they had not done so adequately.
Scott, today the U.S. president tweeted his outrage over these rulings, and he said that other presidents have enjoyed broad deference by the courts, but not him. What does he mean by that, and is that true?
It's not clear entirely what he means. Deference is usually a sort of term we associate with other sorts of legal questions, not really implicated here. In this case, we have seen presidents be forced to comply with criminal investigations, such as happened to President Nixon, and request for information there. We've seen presidents have to comply with civil investigation, as happened with President Clinton in regards to Paula Jones. And certainly the Vance case, at least, is very much consistent with those. The Mazar's case regarding congressional requests is a bit of a new novel question, at least as confronted by the courts in this case. But again, it confirms what most people expected, which is generally consistent with the law as it's understood in the United States, which is that Congress has a substantial authority to request this sort of information, perhaps with some limits in extreme cases, but still substantial authority. And this affirmed that. And that was, again, something that the president was arguing against.
Now, we know based on today's rulings that New York prosecutors, they will probably ask to see the tax returns and see those tax returns. Now, if these documents, if they become evidence in a criminal investigation, and if there is enough here to issue an indictment, what happens to Donald Trump if he's reelected president? And what happens to Donald Trump if he is not reelected and becomes private citizen Donald Trump?
Certainly, if he becomes a private citizen, it's a likely scenario that we will see the president have to answer those charges in the same way that any other private citizen would. At that point, the separation of powers concerns and other concerns regarding the impact on the president and his conduct of this role and his ability to exercise his function as president being hampered by any sort of litigation or criminal defense likely isn't going to be implicated. If he remains in office, and the president is no doubtly going to argue that as long as I'm in office, the fact that this criminal investigation is going to severely hamper my activities as president means that I shouldn't have to face these charges at least so long as I'm in office. And that if the United States or if the U.S. institutions want me to face these charges, Congress can impeach me. And then it becomes a question as to whether really Congress is going to be willing to take that step to remove him from office and force him to confront those charges, or whether there may be some other legal avenue by which the president may be held accountable. That is a fact pattern that we haven't really encountered before in this case so squarely, about a president being criminally prosecuted by a state, and it raises a range of novel legal questions, but all of which are highly problematic, including for the president.
Let me ask you this about the legality of a deal before leaving the White House, Scott. There has been talk that if the president were to leave, let's say if there were to be another impeachment trial, that maybe he would resign, and he would resign only with a deal to have immunity after leaving the White House. Would that be legal? Is there any precedent in U.S. history for something like that happening?
That's an interesting fact pattern that I have not actually heard directly before. In terms of resigning and trading away the office of the presidency, that would be a pretty exceptional thing for the state of New York to demand in regards to the Mazars case, or for Congress to demand in regards to these subpoenas, which again are just requesting information. I find it hard to believe that that would actually be a condition that either party would put forward or seek out in those sorts of negotiations. If the president wants to resign to reduce scrutiny on him, he certainly can do so. He may resign and then seek a pardon from his vice president, who would then be president and get the pardon power. In the case of Mike Pence, that's a possibility. At least that was discussed in the context of Richard Nixon. Did happen in Richard Nixon's case, I should say. Of course, President Ford then pardoned Nixon after he left office. But again, it's not clear whether Pence would play along with that here. It certainly would raise certain eyebrows. So I don't know how seriously I would take any of those concerns at this point, particularly because not many of these matters are likely to come to fruition before the November elections. Almost all of them are going to come to fruition afterwards.
Yeah, that's a very good point. We want to remind our viewers, Scott, about the controversy over Trump's tax returns. Trump says that his taxes are still being audited. It's been a long period for the audit. 4 years ago, before the election, I spoke with Nick Shaxson. He's one of the only journalists to ever interview Donald Trump about his taxes. And this is what Shaxson said in July 2016 about Trump not wanting to release his tax returns.
One of the things I was looking for, because I'm an expert in tax havens, I was looking for Donald Trump using tax havens. And I asked him a couple of times about this. And he said, I don't use tax havens because you can get everything you need in the United States. And you may doubt his words. I mean, he says a lot of things that people don't believe. But I think, speaking to a lot of tax experts in the States, they did find that plausible. because it is just so easy to get right down to zero. You just don't need to use them. And he told me, they're complicated. Nobody knows what's going on. Tax havens are kind of difficult things to use. And, it is plausible. His new line of business is licensing. So
his name, right?
Licensing his name, yes. So he will get, somebody will say, we're going to build a building in India or Saudi Arabia or somewhere like that, and we want to put the Trump name on the top. And he'll say, yes, you can do that, and you pay me, a few million up front.
It's like a franchise almost,
It's like a franchise, yeah. And so he's doing that all over the place. And he told me that he's got 121 of these licensing deals in the pipeline. We'll wait and see what comes out.
Well, it's all the money he's getting then from these overseas license buyers. Is that money then coming directly into the U.S.? I mean, because that's a great chance for him or for anyone to keep it offshore.
Exactly. I mean, that was one of the sort of hypotheses I looked at. And I think there's no evidence that he's doing any of that in a very aggressive way. No evidence that I could find that he's keeping that offshore. I mean, it was, there were tax advisors who said he could be doing that. We can't see it because his tax affairs are secret. He hasn't released his tax returns. Those tax returns would answer these questions.
Right. So that was the state of play 4 years ago. Not a lot has changed there, but we know the president may be trying to avoid more than just tax troubles. Scott, Nancy Pelosi today saying Congress has not finished investigating the president. The court today, the Supreme Court, it did not say that Congress has no right to see Trump's tax returns. The court had a problem with how Congress had tried to obtain those returns. Is that correct?
To some extent. It may be more proper to say that the Supreme Court had a problem with how the lower courts evaluated Congress requests. Essentially, the lower courts said, hey, these are requests to banks and accountants, not to the president himself. So they don't really implicate major separation of powers concerns regarding the executive branch and the legislative branch. We don't need to evaluate those concerns. The Supreme Court came today and said, no, you actually do. Even though this is to a third party, it can affect the executive branch's interests, and you need to look at them more closely. And therefore, going to remand and force you to take another closer look, bearing in mind a list of factors they sort of identified. So it doesn't mean that Congress can't get these filed at all. If anything, I would read the opinion as suggesting they can in certain circumstances, but it did indicate there are strong countervailing interests in the executive branch that the lower courts and Congress need to take into account, and it sent the matter back to the lower courts to make sure that they are taken into account.
Scott Anderson with the Brookings Institution, helping us to understand these rulings today coming up from the Supreme Court. Scott, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.